The ground gave it up reluctantly. That's what I remember most. Not the smell, not the rust on the lid, not even what was inside. It was the way the earth held on to it, the way the dirt had settled and packed and made peace with the thing buried beneath it over 3 long years. Vasquez and I stood at the edge of that hole in the gray November light, breath clouding, watching the county deputy pry the lid with a flathead. Inside, rope coiled neat, a knife and oilcloth, gloves folded, lye double-sealed, a short-handled shovel collapsed and strapped, a kit, a patient, premeditated kit waiting for a purpose its owner hadn't yet assigned, scratched into the inside of the lid with a knife point, a date, November 1950. 3 years ago. I lit a cigarette and looked at the woods around us. Ordinary, bare-limbed Illinois timber, nothing remarkable, nothing to explain why this spot or why that date or why any of it. I said it out loud because sometimes that's all you can do. Most men plan a murder after they pick a victim. This man buried the hole 3 years before he had anyone to put in it. We didn't know it yet, but we were already behind. We'd been behind since the day he dug it.
November 1950. The woods off Route 14, DuPage County, a Tuesday afternoon with nothing special about it. I parked the truck on the gravel shoulder and walked into the trees carrying a canvas bag and a short-handled shovel. No urgency in it. I'd scouted this spot twice already on jobs that took me along this road. Noted the drainage, the canopy cover, the distance from the tree line to where a man could work without being seen. I chose a spot between 2 oaks, marked it in my memory, and began to dig. I didn't whistle while I worked. That came after. There's an economy to physical labor when you've done it your whole life. You learn not to waste motion. The container went in level, lid sealed with a rubber gasket I'd bought separately from a hardware store in Elgin, paid cash. I packed the earth back carefully, broke up the spoil with my boot heel to blend it with the leaf matter, scattered some dead leaves over the disturbed patch, stood back, assessed it, found it acceptable, picked up the bag and the shovel and walked back to the truck. Then I whistled, low and even, all the way to the road.
He was home by 6. Margaret had made a pork roast and the house smelled like rosemary and something warm and completely domestic. Dorothy was home for the week, visiting from her apartment in Evanston, and she was setting the table when Walter came in through the back, hung his coat on the hook, washed his hands at the kitchen sink with the thoroughness of a man whose work gets into the skin. Dorothy asked about his day. She always asked. She had her mother's curiosity and her father's patience, which made her a good listener. Walter dried his hands and said just scouting some property for a job, measuring up a farmhouse on the Route 14 side. Not technically a lie. He had looked at a farmhouse on that road in September. The property was real. The job was real. The rest was an addition to the day that required no mention because it was simply his. Margaret poured him coffee, and he sat and they ate, and Dorothy talked about a man she'd met at a party in Evanston, a pleasant, earnest young man named Robert who worked in insurance. Walter listened carefully. He asked the right questions. He laughed at the right moments. By 8 o'clock he was reading the paper in his chair, and the day was entirely ordinary, entirely closed. The call came in on a Thursday morning, October 1953. A traveling salesman named Raymond Cord, 41 years of age, found in a ravine off a county road in Kane County by a pair of deer hunters who had no reason to be where they were. No wallet taken, no watch taken. The violence was deliberate and contained. I won't put the particulars in this telling because they don't illuminate anything, and Raymond Cord deserves at least the dignity of privacy in what was done to him. I drove out with Vasquez in the morning gray and stood in that ravine and looked at what remained of a man who had sold industrial cleaning supplies for 11 years and was 2 weeks from his daughter's birthday. Nothing about the site told me anything useful. No tracks in the hard October ground. No discarded material, no cigarette, no wrapper, nothing accidentally left. Whoever did this had been here before in the sense that they knew exactly what to bring and what not to leave. Vasquez said robbery gone wrong. I looked at Raymond Cord's watch still on his wrist and his wallet still in his coat and said nothing. Sometimes the most useful thing you can do is keep your mouth shut and let the scene keep talking. I listened for a long time. The ravine didn't give me much, but it gave me the feeling that this was not a first attempt.
6 months before that salesman turned up in his ravine, I was in Kendall County on a legitimate job. A farmhouse exterior, 3 coats, the owner wanted cream over gray, and I'd given him a fair price that included the trim. Finished by 3 in the afternoon. Packed the ladders and drop cloths into the truck with the care a man gives equipment he respects. Then I drove 3 miles further east on a road I'd scouted the previous spring during a different job, parked, and walked into the timber with the canvas bag. The second container was slightly larger than the first, same construction, same gasket seal, same contents, rope, knife, gloves, lye, collapsible shovel. Each component purchased separately, spread across 8 months, different counties, different stores, cash every time, nothing connecting one purchase to another or to me. I thought about it the way a careful tradesman thinks about sourcing materials: cost, reliability, traceability. I was thinking about traceability before the word existed in policing the way it would come to. Buried the second container, packed the earth, scattered leaf matter, stood back, assessed, found it acceptable, drove back to the county road. The cream over gray farmhouse was behind me, the job done right, the owner satisfied. A good day's work by any measure I chose to apply.
Raymond Cord's wife was a small woman named Helen who kept offering me coffee I didn't want because it gave her something to do with her hands. Their house in Elgin was the kind of house where a man lives who works on the road. Neat in a managed way, not a lived-in way, because one of the 2 people who live there is only there intermittently. I asked the right questions. Debts, no significant ones. Arguments, business disagreements, nothing personal. A woman, someone from before. Helen's eyes went somewhere for a second, then came back and she shook her head. Nothing that would end this way. I believed her. Pryor had faxed me a note that morning insisting on the robbery angle, pointing to 3 unsolved highway robberies in the region over the past 18 months, none of which matched Raymond Cord's circumstance in any material way. I filed the note and ignored it the way you ignore advice that's wrong but comes from someone with authority over your pay grade. Raymond Cord had no enemies worth the word. He was, by all available evidence, a man who moved through the world without disturbing it enough to generate the kind of hatred that ends in a ravine, which was the first thing that should have told me something. The hatred, if that's even what it was, had nothing to do with Raymond Cord. Walter Greer had run his painting and decorating business since 1938, when he bought out his former employer, a German named Hausmann, who was retiring and whose clients liked Walter's steadiness and his fair estimates. By 1953, he had a solid reputation across 6 counties: DuPage, Kane, Kendall, Will, Grundy, and the western edge of Cook. The kind of reputation built not on charm, but on showing up, doing what you said you'd do, and leaving the site cleaner than you found it. His clients left him reviews in the way people left reviews in those days. They called their neighbors and said, "Use Greer. He does right by you." He drove the same white panel truck through those 6 counties, spring through fall, ladder racks on the roof, the name of his business lettered on the side doors in a conservative dark blue. He was a fixture on those roads the way mailmen and milk trucks were fixtures, expected, unremarkable, pleasantly familiar. His clients knew his name. Some knew Margaret's name. Some had met Dorothy. He attended the Methodist Church on alternate Sundays. He paid his taxes without complaint. He had, in every externally observable sense, built a life of complete, unremarkable decency. The panel truck rolled through all 6 counties with a reason to be anywhere on any road at any reasonable hour, and nobody looked twice. The second body was a school teacher named Arthur Poole, 53 years old, 8th grade mathematics at a consolidated school in Grundy County, found in a drainage ditch off a farm road by a man checking his tile line after a hard rain in late October. The county sheriff called me because he'd read my report on Raymond Cord, and the absence of motive in both cases had started to rhyme for him. He was a good sheriff, the kind who knows the limit of his jurisdiction and calls for help before pride gets in the way. I drove down with Vasquez and stood in another piece of rural Illinois looking at another man who had no reason to be here except the worst one. Arthur Poole had a wife and 2 grown sons. He had been on his way home from a school board meeting. He had taken a different road than usual because of construction on the county highway. Vasquez said, "Wrong place, wrong time, robbery," and I understood why he wanted that to be the answer, because the alternative was worse. But Raymond Cord's watch was still on his wrist when we found him, and Arthur Poole's wedding ring was still on his finger. And if this was robbery, it was the least interested robbery I'd encountered in 39 years on this job. These men weren't targets. They were something else, and I couldn't name it yet. Vasquez and I sat in the Grundy County Sheriff's office with both case files open on the table and a pot of bad coffee between us, and I went through it again the way you do when you're trying to see something you haven't yet. Raymond Cord, traveling salesman, Kane County. Arthur Poole, school teacher, Grundy County. 41 miles apart. No shared acquaintances, no shared geography in life. No shared anything except the manner of their deaths and the absence of anything taken and the absence of any witness. Vasquez said they might still be separate incidents, coincidence, different perpetrators. I understood the argument. I also understood that 2 crimes with identical signatures and identical non-motives in the same 18-month window in neighboring counties was not a coincidence I was prepared to accept. I said to Vasquez, "There's no pattern in the victims, so the pattern's somewhere else." Vasquez looked at me across the table with the expression he gets when he knows I'm right and wishes I weren't. He said, "Where?" I looked at the 2 files and said, "I don't know yet. That's what scares me." The coffee was terrible. The files stayed open. Outside the county sheriff's window, the flat Illinois dark was coming on, and there was nothing in it that looked back.
8 months before that salesman turned up, roughly February of '53, a gray Wednesday, I stopped for coffee at a diner on the state highway outside Sandwich. Sat at the counter, ordered black coffee and a piece of pie, ate without haste. 2 stools down, a man was eating alone too. Middle-aged, traveling bag under the stool, the look of someone who's comfortable eating alone because he does it professionally. I noticed him the way I notice things, without apparent interest, without looking twice. Left the diner 7 minutes after he did, drove the same road, noted the make and color of his car, the plate, the direction of travel. Didn't follow him. Just noted, cataloged, let it settle. Came back to the same diner 3 more times over the next 3 days, different hours, on the pretext of jobs in the area that were real jobs. The 3rd time, he was there again. Same stool, same coffee, same traveling bag. Pattern. 4th day, I drove past his car parked outside a motel on the highway and noted the name and the room number from the car's position against the numbered doors. Drove to a county road 3 miles further east, found a spot I'd noted the previous autumn, and thought about whether this was the time. Decided it wasn't yet. Drove home, had dinner with Margaret.
The detail that pulled me somewhere new was a residue. Grundy County's forensic work wasn't sophisticated. This was rural Illinois, 1953, not a Chicago lab. But the deputy who processed the site near Arthur Poole's body was thorough in the old-fashioned way, meaning he picked up everything that shouldn't be there and bagged it and labeled it. One of his bags contained a flake of rubberized material, about the size of a thumbnail, caught on a root near the site. I had it sent to the state lab. Rubberized compound consistent with waterproofing sealant, industrial grade, not household variety. Nothing at the site required waterproofing. I sat with that for 3 days. The killer hadn't brought this material to the site that day. The quantity was too small, the condition too degraded. It had been there before. It had transferred from something stored here or previously present here, and the site had been visited before. I didn't know what had been stored here. I didn't know when or why, but I knew that a man who plans in advance to the degree of pre-treating materials against weather has a patience and a foresight that no ordinary crime of passion or opportunity contains. He wasn't reacting. He was executing a plan he'd had for longer than the victim had been selected. The victim, I was beginning to understand, might be the last thing he decided.
January 1953, 3 months before the salesman, I drove to DuPage County on a legitimate estimate. A large Victorian on the east side of Wheaton, owner wanted the exterior stripped and repainted by spring. Gave a good estimate, left my card, drove north on a county road 4 miles until I reached the tree line I'd mapped. Parked, walked in. The container I'd buried in November 1950 came up clean. The rubber gasket it held, the contents in good order, knife edge still sharp, rope undegraded. 2 years and 2 months in the ground and everything ready. Repacked it into the canvas bag, replaced the empty hole with a light infill of soil and leaf matter, no point leaving a void, and walked back to the truck. Placed the bag behind the spare ladder in the cargo area under a drop cloth. Just equipment now, same as the brushes, the tape, the rollers. Equipment I'd need for a job. Drove back toward the highway and stopped for coffee. The bag sat behind me under the cloth. A sheriff's deputy was at the next table eating a sandwich. We nodded at each other the way 2 men nod when they're both just doing their work. Finished my coffee, drove home. The kit rode under the drop cloth the whole way.
The third body was a retired pharmacist named Gerald Hess, 60 years old, Will County, November 1953. The county coroner's office sent me the file because a deputy there had read both previous reports through the state clearinghouse. I drove out, and I stood at another site, and I looked at another man who had no enemies and no reason to be at the center of anything. Pryor called me that afternoon from his office in Chicago, which is the kind of management technique that lets a man feel involved without driving anywhere. He said, "Mahoney, you need a theory." I said I had several. He said, "Give me one that holds up in a meeting." I said I'd call him when I had it. He said, "The papers are going to start asking questions." I said, "Let them. That's their job." And he made the sound he makes when he's weighing whether to pull me off something. He didn't pull me. I spread a state road map on the hood of my car and put pins in 3 spots. Kane, Grundy, Will. 6 counties within a day's drive of Chicago, spread like a hand of cards. No overlap in the victims' lives. I stood there in the November cold and looked at the pins and understood that the geography was someone else's, not the victims'. Someone was moving through these counties for reasons of their own. The victims were incidental to the route. That was the worst thing I'd understood so far, and I'd understood some bad things. The dress fitting was at a shop on Maple Street in Evanston, a Thursday afternoon in September 1953. Margaret had driven up to meet Dorothy, and Walter had come separately from a job in Wilmette, still in his work clothes, paint on his knuckles, and the woman at the shop had given him a slightly reproving look that Margaret had laughed at quietly. Dorothy came out in the dress, ivory, simple, well-made, and Walter Greer stood in that small, overheated shop, and his eyes filled. Not performed, not managed, not deployed for effect. His eyes simply filled, the way a man's eyes fill when he sees something that represents the sum of every ordinary day he spent building a life, concentrated into one unrepeatable moment. Margaret took his hand and squeezed it, and he let her. Dorothy said, "Papa, don't you dare," and laughed, and he laughed too and pressed his thumb and forefinger to his eyes. Robert, the earnest young insurance man from Evanston, was going to make Dorothy happy. Walter had made a thorough private assessment of Robert over 14 months of dinners and conversations and a fishing trip in August, and had concluded that Robert was precisely what Dorothy needed: steady, unhurried, entirely devoted. The dress was perfect. The wedding was 8 weeks out. Walter drove home with paint on his knuckles and his chest full of something entirely genuine and warm. This was also real. Both things were real. Eleanor was still home that November. The move to her sister's place in Rockford wouldn't come until the following year, when things in the city got complicated enough that I insisted, and she eventually agreed. She made dinner, and I sat at the table and ate it without tasting it, and she watched me the way she watches me when she's decided to wait me out. After the dishes, she poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of me and said, "Jack, what's wrong?" I tried to explain it. 3 bodies spread across the county roads of rural Illinois, No pattern in the victims, no personal connection, no robbery, no rivalry, no reason that presented itself in any form I recognized as human. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Maybe the why isn't a why you'd understand." I went quiet. She didn't mean it as a challenge. Eleanor doesn't do challenges dressed as observations. She just says the things she actually thinks, which is one of the things I've always loved about her, and one of the things that makes the distance between us, when it comes, feel more precise. I sat with what she said. Maybe the why isn't a why you'd understand. I turned it over. Most murder has a logic to it, a terrible, broken, recognizable logic. What if this one had a logic I simply didn't have the frame for? I drank my coffee. I didn't sleep well.
I'd planned the fourth container for the spring of '51, scouted a site in Grundy County, good tree cover, accessible by a farm road that would have legitimate traffic during planting season, remote enough in winter, assembled the materials by March, but April brought a contract I hadn't anticipated, a full commercial job, 3 storefronts in Morris, 2 months of work that stretched a month past my estimate when the second storefront needed more prep than I'd assessed. By June, it was too hot to work in the woods without attracting attention. By fall, there was Dorothy's birthday and Thanksgiving and 2 smaller jobs that overlapped poorly. The fourth container didn't go in the ground until December '51, 9 months late, and I buried it in something closer to a hurry than I'd allowed myself before. Not a rush. I don't rush, but I worked in cold I hadn't accounted for, which meant my hands were less precise than usual, which meant the gasket seal, when I checked it, was adequate but not what I'd want. I noted that. Told myself I'd check it on retrieval. Packed the earth, scattered leaf matter, stood back, assessed. Found it adequate. Adequate was not my standard. Walked to the truck. Noted in my own private ledger that the fourth kit was a grade below the others. Drove home. Said nothing about it to anyone.
Fourth body, December 1953. A retired railroad worker named Emmett Slade, 64 years old, Kendall County, found on a farm road by the man who plowed that road after the first heavy snow. I drove out in the dark at 5 in the morning and stood in the headlights of 3 county vehicles looking at the snow-covered shape of what the winter had partially preserved, and I pulled all 4 case files in the car on the drive back and read them through again from scratch without the context I'd accumulated, trying to see them new. I spread them on the conference table at the precinct and put county maps over them and drew the circle and put the bodies at the perimeter and looked at what the circle contained. The western commuter counties, the county road networks, the areas serviced by tradesmen and contractors who work across county lines. None of these 4 men had a reason to be specifically targeted. All 4 were found near county roads, within accessible distance of legitimate commercial routes, within a day's drive of Chicago. I had a profile that was 4 lines long, travels for work, multiple counties, plans years ahead, no personal stake in victims. I called Vasquez at 6 in the morning and said, "We're looking for a tradesman." He said, "That's 2,000 people." I said, "Narrow it. We need records." The request went to the Illinois Department of Labor and to the county licensing offices in all 6 counties the same day. I asked for records of all active trade and construction licenses, painters, plasterers, contractors, electricians, plumbers, roofers, currently operating across more than one of the 6 counties, DuPage, Kane, Kendall, Will, Grundy, Cook, west of Mannheim Road. Vasquez coordinated the requests, and I gave him the criteria in writing so there was no ambiguity and no license board could say they hadn't understood. The records came back across 4 days, county by county, in folders that varied in quality from very good to barely legible, which is rural Illinois County Administration in 1953. By Friday, we had a list of 412 names, 412 men who had legitimate reasons to be on the county road networks of the 6 counties at various times for various purposes. Vasquez looked at the stack of files and said something I won't repeat here. I understood the sentiment. We had no way to further narrow the list without another data point, something that connected the method to a specific type of trade, a specific territory, a specific purchasing pattern. I didn't have that yet. I had 412 names and a profile and 4 dead men and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from too much work, but from work that resists completion.
I drove out alone to check on the 5th container, a routine inspection, the kind I did periodically when a job took me near a site. Found it compromised. Water had gotten past the gasket sometime in the last 2 years, more than I'd allowed for, and the contents inside showed it. Rust on the knife, the rope gone soft and unreliable, the lie caked and useless. I crouched there a long moment, looking at it the way a craftsman looks at a flaw in his materials. Not frustration. I don't do frustration. It wastes the kind of attention that solves a problem, just an adjustment. The 5th site was unusable in its current state. I'd need to work differently when the time came. Improvise from what I carried day to day, rather than draw on something built for the purpose. I noted this the way I noted everything, filed, considered, accounted for. Repacked the ruined container, left it where it was, no reason to disturb the ground further, and walked back to the truck. The frost was hard that morning. My breath went out in front of me in long, even clouds the whole walk back. I didn't think about it again until I needed to. The wedding sat on a fixed point, April 12th. I'd been living with that date since October, when Dorothy and Robert booked the church and the hall in Evanston, carrying it the way I carry all fixed points. An orientation, a marker things organize themselves around. The next piece of work wanted to happen before the wedding, not for any complicated reason. I simply prefer a clean interval between one thing and another, the same way I finish one job site before starting the next, the same way I keep my equipment sorted by function. The compromised kit meant I'd be working from the truck. Working from the truck meant using materials that were on legitimate purchase records, not ideal, but manageable. The key was selection, someone far enough from my regular routes that the truck's presence required no explanation, near enough to a county road that the access stayed clean, and alone in the way some people are alone in the middle of the day, with no one expecting a report of where they've gone. I spent 3 days in the second week of March on estimates in 3 counties and did my choosing the same way I choose paint colors for clients. Methodically, without sentiment, from what was in front of me. April 12th held steady on the calendar. Everything else arranged itself accordingly.
The geography was the key, and I should have seen it sooner. I took all 4 victim locations and all 4 disposal sites and mapped the travel corridors that could plausibly serve them. The county roads, the state highways, the commercial routes a tradesman would use moving between jobs. And then I went back to the 412 names and asked a single additional question. Which of these men had documented work activity within 20 miles of all 4 disposal sites within the relevant calendar period? Not the same day, not even the same week, just the same general territory, the same working routes. The licensing records gave us work addresses and client records in some cases. Vasquez pulled business permit filings from each county. We took 3 days and went through every name on the list. When we finished, we had 40 names, 40 men whose legitimate work routes overlapped all 4 locations over the relevant period. Vasquez said, "That's manageable." I said, "Start background checks, domestic situations, prior records, anything that suggests preparation or prior violence." He said, "What are we looking for?" I said, "Nothing. That's exactly what we're looking for. No obvious motive, no record, no prior, perfectly clean. The cleanest one on the list. The one that looks most like nobody." Vasquez did not find this reassuring, which was the appropriate response.
I wasn't comfortable. Worth saying because discomfort wasn't something I felt often doing this work, and the fact of it, small, controlled, but unmistakably there, was itself a data point in the private ledger I keep on my own performance. Working from materials in the truck, drop cloth canvas, heavy duty, paint stained from 18 months of legitimate use, work rope, bought in Joliet 8 months back for a scaffolding job, a fixed blade utility knife off my tool belt, work gloves, lie I'd had since the previous fall, bought legitimately, used legitimately, with some left over. Everything traceable, everything explainable, every item a natural resident of a painter's truck with a history of work to justify it. But I knew it was different. The buried kits were different because their origin was untracked. Purchase spread across time and geography, paid in cash, assembled and stored and aged until provenance dissolved entirely. This was improvisation, and improvisation lets in a tolerance for chance the kits were specifically built to eliminate. I knew it the way a surgeon knows he's working in suboptimal conditions. I kept going anyway. A county road in Will County, a March morning, gray and cold and completely empty. Work to do.
The fifth body was found by a mail carrier on a rural route in Will County on a Thursday morning in March 1954, 3 weeks before Dorothy Greer's wedding. A farm supply salesman named Harold Ketch, 47 years old, last seen leaving a feed store in Braidwood at 11 on a Wednesday. I drove out with Vasquez, and I stood in the cold and looked at the site, and I knew immediately that something was different. Not the victim. I didn't know Harold Ketch from Raymond Cord from any other name on this terrible list. The site was different. The others had been almost surgical in their absence of evidence. This one had a piece of canvas tarp caught on a hawthorn root at the edge of the clearing, not left deliberately, not dropped as some kind of signal, just torn loose from something and left because the conditions that morning had required speed the others hadn't. It was paint-stained. Heavy canvas, commercial grade, the particular weight used in painting and decorating work as a drop cloth. I crouched over it without touching it and looked at the stain pattern. Multiple colors. Clearly a working cloth, not new, not purchased for this purpose. Something that had been in someone's truck for a long time. I looked at Vasquez, and he looked at me, and neither of us said anything for a long moment. Then I said, "Bag it carefully and get it to the state lab tonight." Edna Marcellus was 67 years old and lived in a farmhouse a quarter-mile from the county road where Harold Ketch's car had been found parked and empty on Wednesday afternoon. She had been hanging laundry. The good drying wind, she explained, and she had seen a truck on the county road, white or cream. She'd thought it was the Henderson's boy from the next property, who had a light-colored truck and sometimes drove that road when the main route was muddy. She hadn't looked closely because there was no reason to. She'd looked the way people look at familiar patterns, registering the presence without examining the detail. She couldn't give me the number or even confirm the specific shade. But she'd seen a truck, white or close to it, parked on the shoulder for perhaps 40 minutes in the middle of Wednesday afternoon, and then gone when she came back to collect the laundry. She apologized for not being more certain. I told her she'd been helpful, which was true, and that she hadn't done anything wrong by not looking more carefully, which was also true. And the thing I didn't say was that somewhere on a county road between here and Chicago, a man with a white truck was driving home completely unaware that a 67-year-old woman hanging her laundry had just put him a single step closer to a name. The state lab confirmed the canvas was commercial-grade drop-cloth material, manufactured by a company called National Canvas Supply out of Rockford, sold through 11 regional distributors in the greater Chicago and downstate area. Not common household material, specifically for trade use, painting, plastering, flooring work. I had the distributor records pulled for all sales in the 6-county area going back 4 years. It narrowed our universe considerably. Then Vasquez came back from the vehicle registration office with a breakdown of all trucks matching Edna Marcellus's description. White or cream panel trucks, registered to individuals or small businesses in our 6-county area, and cross-referenced it against the trade license list and the canvas distributor records. The list of 40 became a list of 16. Then 12 after 2 were deceased. One was in Kankakee recovering from surgery, and one had sold his business and moved to Florida in January. 12 white or cream commercial trucks, painting or decorating trade, with documented work history across all 6 counties, whose vehicles matched the description, whose trade supply record showed canvas consistent with the sample. I looked at the 12 names. Vasquez had done preliminary research on each overnight: address, marital status, prior record, business registration date. I read through them in order. I stopped at the sixth one. Walter Greer, painting and decorating, DuPage County, registered 1938, no prior record of any kind. Vasquez confirmed it in detail over the next morning. Walter Greer's documented work routes over the past 3 years crossed within verifiable range of all 5 body locations. Not the same day, nothing that direct, but his client records and his business permit filing showed legitimate work activity in all 6 counties during the relevant periods. His truck matched. His trade materials matched the canvas sample. His record was empty in the specific way that only entirely innocent people and extremely careful ones share. No speeding tickets, no disputes, no civil complaints, nothing that would flag him to anyone looking without purpose. Married 22 years, 1 daughter who was getting married in 3 weeks. Methodist church, community standing, well liked by clients across the region. I sat with this for a long time. The case was built on absence and geography and a torn piece of canvas and a neighbor who hadn't looked closely. It was not enough for an arrest. It was enough to knock on a door. I called Vasquez in and told him we were going to Wheaton. He asked me how solid it was. I said it was the best we had on the list. He asked what my read was. I said I didn't have one yet. I wanted to look at the man. Sometimes looking at someone tells you what the file can't. Sometimes it doesn't. We drove to Wheaton. The morning that Vasquez pulled Walter Greer's file and confirmed the overlap in 3 counties' worth of records, Walter Greer was at Rosalind's Bridal on Maple Street in Evanston for Dorothy's final fitting. The alterations were done. The hem was perfect. Dorothy came out of the dressing room and stood in front of the mirror, and Margaret put her hand over her mouth, and Walter stood behind them both, a quiet man in a good clean shirt. A man who had taken the morning off from 2 estimates to be here because there was nothing he would have traded this for. Robert was meeting them for lunch afterward. Walter had made the reservation himself 3 weeks ago at a restaurant on Church Street that Dorothy liked. He stood in the bridal shop in the warm, overheated air and watched his daughter look at herself in the mirror, and his face did what faces do when the accumulation of every ordinary thing you ever built comes to a point and holds itself there for a moment in the light. 40 miles south, a detective had just written his name on a notepad for the first time. Walter Greer stood in the bridal shop, entirely present, entirely warm, entirely unaware that the interval was closing. Dorothy turned from the mirror and said, "Well," he said. "Perfect." It was. Margaret Greer answered the door. She was a woman in her mid-40s with a pleasant open face and the kind of composure that comes from a settled life and a satisfied domestic arrangement. She didn't look at my badge with alarm. People who have nothing to worry about usually don't, which means nothing, since people who have something to worry about are often equally untroubled. I introduced myself and Vasquez and said we had some questions about several matters in the county road area and asked if Mr. Greer was available. She said, of course, come in. Would we like coffee? And led us through a house that was clean and ordered and contained no strangeness, no dark corners, no wrongness you could point to. The paint samples on the kitchen table were work samples. The family photographs on the wall were family photographs. Walter Greer came from the back of the house, wiping his hands on a rag. Actual paint, actual hands. A man genuinely in the middle of a working morning. He was medium height, broad across the shoulders the way physical laborers get, with a face that was unremarkable in the way that made you want to look away and find something more distinctive to fix on. He smiled at us with the pleasant curiosity of a man who has done nothing and has no reason to perform innocence because innocence requires no performance. My hands were doing what they do when I'm under stress. I pushed them into my coat pockets and looked at Walter Greer and almost for 1 full second doubted the list. We sat at the kitchen table with coffee we didn't need, and I walked Walter Greer through his work schedule over the past 3 years, county by county, date by date, as much as he could recall. He was cooperative in a way that registered as genuine rather than performed. He didn't over-explain, didn't circle back to volunteer information, didn't pre-answer questions I hadn't asked. He said he didn't know exactly. He'd have to check his ledger on several dates, which was the answer an innocent man who keeps a business ledger would give. He said he might have been in that area around that time. He did a lot of work over that way on 2 of the locations I named. His alibis were imprecise in the way a man's alibis are imprecise when they're real and when he's not been expecting to need them. He was neither too specific nor too vague. He was exactly calibrated to the exact level of cooperative uncertainty that served him perfectly. I watched his hands the whole time, steady, completely, absolutely steady, resting on the table or wrapped around his coffee cup without the smallest tremor. I've sat across from a lot of men under pressure. Even innocent men fidget. My hands were in my lap, unsteady, and his were on the table still. He answered every question and gave me nothing I could use. The coffee was good. The imprecision in his alibi for November 12, 1953, the night Emmett Slade was found in Kendall County, was the thread I pulled on with the duty judge the following morning. It wasn't much. It was enough. The warrant covered the truck and a storage shed registered to his business address, which he'd mentioned offhandedly during the interview as where he kept his seasonal equipment. Vasquez served it with 2 county deputies at 7 in the morning. I wasn't there. I was at the precinct writing the affidavit supporting documentation in case the warrant was challenged. Vasquez called me at 8:45. In the shed, canvas drop cloth material from the same manufacturer as the tarp fragment found at Harold Ketch's disposal site, same lot markings, same production run. In the truck, utility knife, work rope, a partial container of lye, work gloves in 2 sizes, his size and 1 size smaller, the smaller pair still folded as if unused, and under the false floor of the cargo bay, a detail Vasquez found because he went over it with the kind of thoroughness that takes twice as long and finds what a quick search misses. A waterproof container, empty, with a rubber gasket on the lid that matched the compound found at Arthur Poole's site. Walter Greer was brought to the county jail at 10:15 and processed without incident. He asked politely if someone could call his wife. He'd been in the room 2 hours by the time I got there. They'd given him coffee, which he'd accepted, and a chair with some padding, which was more than the room usually offered, because Vasquez had made the reasonable judgment that a man who was going to talk would talk better without the addition of physical discomfort to his list of things to manage. I came in with the files, all 5 stacked, set on the table between us without ceremony. Walter Greer looked at the stack and then at me with an expression that was not afraid and not defiant. It was attentive, the way a man is attentive at the start of a meeting whose agenda he already knows. His hands were folded on the table, still, as always. I sat down and opened the first file and laid out everything we had. 5 bodies, 6 counties, 3 years of buried preparation, the canvas match, the container, the waterproofing compound, the travel routes, the truck. I was thorough because thoroughness is a tool in this room. It says to the man across the table that the walls are already built, that the only question remaining is what happens inside them. Walter Greer listened to all of it without shifting in his chair. He looked at the photographs I placed in front of him. Raymond Cord, Arthur Poole, Gerald Hess, Emmett Slade, Harold Ketch, and he looked at each one with an expression that I couldn't read as guilt and couldn't read as anything else with any certainty. When I finished, he said, "That's very thorough," I said. I had help.
I looked at the photographs on the table and then at Walter Greer, and I asked the question I'd been building towards since November. Why these 5 people? What did they do? He looked at the photographs with me, each one in sequence, as if he were reconsidering something. Then he looked up, and the expression on his face was something close to genuine curiosity. Not at me exactly, but at the question itself, as if he found it interesting in an abstract way. He said, "Nothing. That's not how I chose them." I kept my voice level. I said, "Then how?" He said, "Whoever was there when I needed them to be." The room was very quiet after that. Vasquez was behind the glass. I could feel him behind the glass the way you can feel the presence of another person when both of you are hearing something that requires a moment to settle into the actual shape of what was just said. Whoever was there when I needed them to be. I thought about Raymond Cord's wife in Elgin with her coffee cups and her neat house. I thought about Arthur Poole's 2 sons. I thought about Harold Ketch's mail carrier who found him on a Thursday and who, I'd been told, had not returned to work. I thought about all the weight of these 5 lives reduced to the phrase whoever was there, and I stayed very still, because sometimes staying still is all you have.
I said there had to be a reason. I said it because I needed to say it, not because I believed it would produce one. Money, anger, revenge. I named the architecture of murder that I'd spent 40 years inside, the recognizable shapes that let you do this work without losing the sense that the world has an underlying logic, that things happen because other things made them happen, that violence has a genealogy you can trace. Walter Greer looked at me across the table with something that was almost kind, almost in the way that a man is kind when he's genuinely sorry he can't give you something you need. He said, quiet, unhurried, with no performance in it at all, "You're looking for a why. There isn't one. That's the part you can't accept." The room held that. I sat with it the way you sit with a weight that you know you'll have to carry and that you already know you can't put down. My hands were in my lap, trembling the way they tremble, and I didn't trust myself to put them on the table. He was not gloating. He was not cruel. He was simply telling me something he believed to be true in the same tone he would use to tell me a wall needed 2 coats and not 1. The absence of cruelty was the worst part. The worst part was that he was right that I couldn't accept it. I have 40 years. I have Eleanor. I have the charcoal coat she gave me before things got cold between us. I have not, in 40 years, closed a case file that didn't have a why. I sat in that room and I had nothing to say because there was nothing to say, and Walter Greer waited patiently for my next question, and I couldn't find one that would help. Walter Greer was convicted on 5 counts in October 1954, after a trial that lasted 11 days and produced no compelling alternative theory, because there was no compelling alternative theory. The prosecution's case was physical and geographical, and the defense's was reasonable doubt applied to a man who looked in every respect like a man who should not be here. The jury was out 9 hours. Margaret Greer sat in the gallery through every session, her face a study in bewilderment that never resolved into understanding because there was no understanding to resolve into. Dorothy came on 3 days, once with Robert, who looked sick the entire time, and once alone, sitting perfectly upright in the gallery with her hands in her lap, watching her father's back, and once on the last day when the verdict came. The wedding had happened April 12th, as planned, 9 days after the arrest. Walter had insisted through his attorney that it proceed. Dorothy had gone through with it because she was her father's daughter and she did not leave things unfinished. The reception photographs showed his chair at the head table, set, reserved, a single white carnation in the glass. Dorothy had done that herself. I read about it in the Tribune, and I sat with my report for a long time after that, trying to find a sentence that could hold the fact of what Walter Greer was alongside the fact of that chair and that carnation and the daughter who had placed it. The sentence doesn't exist. I wrote my report in plain language and closed the file on 5 and went home. The courthouse steps were gray, and the October wind off the lake came down LaSalle Street and found every gap in the charcoal wool coat that Eleanor had given me back when we still gave each other things without occasion. I lit a cigarette and stood there a moment before walking to the car. Walter Greer buried 6 containers over 4 years. We found 5. The 6th is still out there, somewhere off a county road, waiting for nobody in particular. I think about that sometimes, not the 5 people he killed, though God knows I think about them too. I think about the 6th hole, dug, packed, sealed, patient, waiting for a stranger who hasn't been born yet, or has, and is walking around right now with no idea a hole exists with his name not yet written on anything near it. That's the part of this job nobody prepares you for. Not the violence, the waiting. Some danger doesn't announce itself. It just digs and packs the dirt back down and walks away whistling and waits as long as it has to. I close the file on 5. I think about the 6th more than I'd like to admit. My hands shook the whole drive back to the precinct. I didn't mention it to anyone. The phone rang the next morning. I answered it. That's the job. You answer even when you know there's a hole somewhere you'll never find in time.